Welcome everyone to Next Level Snap. My name is Peaceful, and I got with me here Lammy as always. Lammy, how you doing this morning, man?
I'm doing great, man. It's nighttime for me right now, but
That's right.
had a
That's
great
right. I
day.
always do that.
Can't wait to record this video.
Absolutely. Make sure if you are liking this content that you subscribe, that you're liking the video, that you comment down below what other topics you'd like to see. All right, I think we got a really sweet topic for you all today. Today we're going to dive into learning to read your opponent and studying your opponent's tendencies and conquest. And the idea behind this is as if you can read your opponent and sort of understand what their play patterns are going to be, what their snapping patterns are, how they like to play out their turns, you can get a huge advantage over your opponent because you can better read and predict what their plays are going to be. So, Lammy, how do you view this topic, and what do you think is important about this topic going into a match of conquest?
Right, so I think this is like specifically more relevant to Conquest because in Conquest you have like multiple rounds to see the same opponent, right? Like so you have more time to like feel them out, more time to like just check out how they play the game and like what is their general skill level at, because like for ladder it's like a sample size of one, unless you're like maybe at the top of the ladder and you keep playing the same few people, then you kind of like can get like tells on how they play and like what they like to play and what's their like preferred tech in their deck and stuff like that. But no, for Conquest I feel most of importantly, this ability to study your opponent's tendencies is very important because you are able to make some what I would like to call 51-49 decisions, which is basically a 50-50 in essence. Like you need to choose to play left or right, you're not sure where, but a 51-49 is like based on how your opponent has been playing. You can decide that all right, they are most likely going to play left instead of right because of so and so factors. And these so and so factors are basically what you notice them do throughout the match. So I think for later in the video we'll go into some examples of what I think certain like tendencies of like players can be.
That's what is so important about this is that conquest a lot of times comes down to those 50-50 decisions, right? You get into those later games and you snap them and you're trying to get that 4, 6, 8 cubes off of them, and if you don't make that read correctly, that can cost you the entire match. So hopefully through this video you all will be able to learn how to exactly figure those things out. So first thing we're going to go over is what are some things that you like to watch for during games of snap to help you read your opponents?
Right, so without going into too specific like card examples, like the actual cards themselves, some like simple tendencies that I notice when players play is firstly the snapping tendencies. This one is the most basic one, and I would say one of the most important as well, which is like, does my opponent generally snap when he is ahead? This is the biggest one. Or do they snap when uh before they show you like a game winning play, combo, or turn? So there's two kinds of players like most of the time. One is the ones that only snap when it's like a done deal, right? You notice the way they snap.
Hmm.
It's like, oh, they snap. I know I'm sure dead. Like I look at the board, I know I'm dead. These kind of players are the kinds that generally only snap because they feel safe, which means they don't get too much cube equity from you because like both sides know that you're dead, right? So you can just retreat for one cube. So this is one kind of player. You can notice this from like maybe even in the early rounds, like in the non-high stakes rounds, they are still very passive. So some players are actually like that, and you can take note of these things. So in the high stakes, you might be able to capitalize off the fact that they are passive. You can play it out a bit more. They won't. You can kind of have the like confidence that they won't snap you even though they have a good hand because they don't find it safe yet. This is one kind of player, and the other kind of player is a bit more dangerous one whereby they don't snap a board that is winning. They snap a game plan. To snap a game plan is basically they snap when they see their hand, they know like the direction the match is going, and they want to snap to get you to stay because you haven't seen their game plan yet. These kind of players are scarier because like normally when they eventually do snap you, you gotta think like, oh, okay, so they snap now. I look at the board, I don't really understand what's going. I don't really know why they're snapping because like I'm not dead. But these kind of players are the kinds that snap and know that in the next 3 turns they can kill you. So these kind of players, when they snap, you kind of need to think, all right, what is the progression of turn like 3, 4, 5, 6 when they snap here? What is their turn 3, 4, 5, 6? So these are the two major like snapping patterns and tendencies that I look out for because it determines also firstly the player skill level because the latter one is generally a better player. The former one is usually a more afraid, safe, inexperienced player. So you can literally just like, all right, snap safe equals not so strong player. Maybe can capitalize on that. Snap a game plan, trying to bait you, probably a decent player. Gotta be careful as well. Gotta think a bit more like what is their general thought process and what they could have. So these are like snapping tendencies. Uh, I think there's one more thing that I want to talk about, which is also not too specific, which is their retreat tendencies. This one is I've talked about it like so many times already. Like just to determine whether someone is like inexperienced or experienced in conquest. When they retreat now, probably they're a bit inexperienced because retreating now is like kind of strictly wrong in conquest because in Marvel Snap in general, because you want to make your opponent sweat, right? I think we've talked about the retreat later, retreat now thing a lot of times already. But players that generally retreat now, they don't realize the power of the retreat later, which is I might retreat as well and no one loses anything, right? Like you gave up, but I might give up. But if you retreat now, I know you gave up. So these things I look for as well to determine if a player is experienced or inexperienced, and I can formulate my game plan going forward as well.
Think a great example of the first one that you were talking about is like against like an electro ramp deck, like playing, say you're playing bounce. This is something that's happened to me a lot just recently. So it's something I kind of thought of is wave and sandman, right? So when those cards are in your opponent's deck and you're playing a deck that's very vulnerable to those cards, a good snap player will snap you on turn 2 when they have electro into sandman. A snap player with a little less experience might play electro, play Sandman, and then once they see that they've got you locked down and you didn't do anything, then they're like, "Oh, okay, they didn't play their hand out. I'm safe now. I can snap." And that's an example of it's a pretty extreme example, but that's sort of what we're talking
Mhm.
about here, where they necessarily they gotta see that they're winning the game before they're willing to put their cubes on the line, which is a good tell. So next up, now that we sort of have a couple examples of what you can look for and how to start reading your opponents, once you start to recognize those tendencies, what should you do with that information?
Right. So for this portion, I'm going into a bit more specific examples and scenarios. Hopefully, you guys can visualize it as well. I'm going to use like one or two scenarios that is very common in the current meta game. So, for example, your opponent. Let's assume that they are a high evolutionary wave deck, right? Basically, I just want to say that they play Nebula. This is very interesting because like you can literally give yourself percentage points in a matchup just by looking at how and where they play their Nebula on turn one. It's quite interesting. So there are some people that like to play Nebula on the left, in the middle, on the right. This is like super important because if you notice they tend to play Nebula on the right, it's actually muscle memory that they always play Nebula on the right. You'll be surprised. Outside of like actual locations that make them change their play patterns, most people when they play like their Nebula in a certain lane, they've been doing it for the last 100 games. They don't realize they've been doing it. But the last 100 games, they've been playing Nebula on the right if it's like neutral situations. So if you notice someone is playing like Nebula on the right, what this means, right, is you don't play your first card into the unknown on the right. You probably play it into the unknown, if you like to do that, in the middle. Which means if they play Nebula on the right turn one, it means you have one extra space because you didn't play on the right as well to contest the Nebula so it doesn't grow as quickly. You'll be surprised how many games this actually wins because the Nebula doesn't go by the extra +2 and you don't actually clog yourself early enough. So noticing where your opponent plays their Nebula is also very important. This is one thing that's like super relevant to the current state of the game, and also like one of the things that I mean in future if they print more cards that have this kind of like placement tendencies, you can literally think about it as like, okay, my opponent likes to play this card in this specific spot. Usually they've been doing it for a long time. That's why they keep playing it in that spot, right? So you can think about it as like, all right, this is a tendency that they have. Another one which is possibly even more common than the first one that I just mentioned is the Doctor Doom tendency, which is the Doctor Doom tendency is basically whether players like to cover all their lanes or are they a bit more risk taking and go tall in two lanes? Because generally, most snap players that I've played against, they like to feel safe, right? A bit like the snapping example. They like to be like, oh, this Doctor Doom covers 5/5/5 on every lane. I am technically up on every lane if I play this Doctor Doom on turn 6. Which means that if they are that kind of player, there is that chance that if you know that they want to do that kind of thing, you just go tall in two lanes. You might guess wrong. You might go tall in the wrong lane and lose. But like if you go tall in two lanes, it kind of like overpowers the 5/5/5 of the Doctor Doom on each lane, the 5 stats on each lane. So a lot of players they like to do this like, oh, Doctor Doom is very safe. Surely they cannot cover 5 points on each lane. And because they think this way, they play the Doom. And because you kind of know that they think this way, instead of going like spread your power out, like if you're playing a bounce deck, you go like monkey all the way up in one lane, and then you just stack like Angela Bishop in one lane, that kind of thing. Like you stack two lanes because you know they like to play Doom. Of course, certain scenarios are very obvious that they cannot play Doom and win if you're like too far ahead. But I mean, those scenarios you're winning anyway. So like I think this is more towards like scenarios where your opponent needs to like decide to spread power or go tall. You can notice that a lot of players like to go wide. When I say a lot of players, I mean like generally, not like everybody, but most people they like to like feel safe and play wide. So you can like capitalize on that by going taller in 2 lanes, which has worked out a lot like for me. And I think one more thing that this last point is a bit like lesser known, but one tendency that I realized I can force people to do, this is more like a tactic that you can force people to do, is you stack power in one lane very, very early. So this is like people always ask me, why do you put your Angela and Bishop in the same lane? To me, my answer to that is always that if I make this lane look so difficult to contest, so difficult to beat, I can sort of know that they might not even try from the get go. And if I know they're not gonna try from the get go, I can just like final turn reallocate it my points somewhere else because they already know that lane looks too difficult to contest, you know. Or like another one which is quite fun to do. I always do it. I play the Iron Man on turn 5 because people are afraid of Iron Man. When they see Iron Man, the first thing they think about is, oh, double power. And because they think double power, they just subconsciously don't want to contest the Iron Man. And then you can sometimes get away with the scammiest of scams, which is like you literally play like 1 power in the Iron Man lane and you win it because they just don't want to contest it, you know. 1 power in the Iron Man lane and something else, everything else everywhere else. Like the hit monkey, full power on another lane, that kind of thing. So it's a lot of things. Like you can maneuver your opponent to do things in a certain way. And at the same time, you also can like look at what your opponent does and be like, all right, surely you've heard this many times, like on streamers, pro players, whatever. They'll be like, oh, they never played left here. They never played right here. You'll be like, how do they know this? How do they know they never played left or never played right here? Well, the player that's saying this, like for example myself, I don't actually know 100% that they will never do it that. But when we say they like never played left, they never played right, it's more like because we know they've been known and shown to not like to do it in this certain way. So we'll be like, all right, most likely they're not gonna do it right now. That kind of thing. So these are tendencies or like things you can pick up on and things that you can make your opponent do and have like get the right read and like make the right call because of the things that you notice.
I guess the other thing to remember is also that your opponents a lot of the time are going to be doing the same thing for you. So that's something else that you can do. If you notice that your opponent seems to play off of what you've done in the past turns a lot, you can also, sort of flip the script on them. That's something that I really enjoy doing is if I
Yep.
see them try and make a play based on what they seem to think my tendencies are, I will intentionally change it just a little bit to make sure that they don't get to take advantage of that. Like if they, for example, like you were talking about with Bishop and Angela, if they notice that and then try and make a play based on that, I can, the next game I'll flip it a little bit and kind of mess with them. And that's another really good way to take advantage of the same thing.
Yeah, I want to add also there's some a little bit even more like in-depth and specific tendencies, but also quite relevant to the meta right now, which is so now it's like a very Elsa slash like counter Elsa kind of game state right now. So there's a lot of Shadow Kings and stuff like that. Like a few things that I've done on intention are like, let's say one game I kind of maybe I lost 2 cubes to them because I like got Shadow Kinged on my Angela, right? Like the games going forward, I tend to maybe let prioritize Angela less and go for like maybe getting more demons with the hood. So these are very immune to like Shadow Kings and all that kind of like counter cards and kind of thing. So you can maneuver yourself a bit differently, like what you said. You play slightly differently because you know that they are like snapping on their wave, they are snapping on their Shadow King. So if you know that this is the kind of things they snap on, I mean, it depends on the deck. It depends. Maybe your deck can like change the game plan, so that's gonna be good. But like, if your deck can change to like a secondary game plan or like something slightly different, and you know they snap on like a game-winning card that sort of ruins your deck, just play a bit differently, and they'll be looking at their Shadow King, their Shang-Chi in their hand for a while, and be like, when can I play this card? When can I play this card? Why are they not like putting the cards on the board for me to use my counter, that kind of thing. Like once
Yeah.
you identify that's what they like to snap on, that's what they like to like feel confident about, you just do it in a slightly different way, and you might squeeze out like a cheap win or like a retreat from them, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. A good example of that is Angela, like you were talking about with Shadow King, but also Angela on 8. Like that was a really common thing with the
Yep.
move deck that you popularized for a while. Is it was like, okay, well, they have Shang and they love playing Shang and they love snapping me on Shang. So that last turn, instead of growing it to 10, 12 power like you could, you just leave Angela at 8 and you have a decent amount of power in that lane. It's like, well, if they play Shang here, they're going to lose because it's not going to kill my Angela and I'm going to have more power there than them. And you can make really good reads like that just based on what your opponent does in the first few turns. All right. Good deal. So that's but really all we had for today. Lamy, why don't you kind of wrap everything up and give everybody sort of like what they should take away from this lesson and how to apply that moving forward for them in Conquest.
Right. So this video is relatively more short. It's also because don't take the fact that it's short to be like it's like less important or whatever. It's actually super important because like in the long run, noticing your opponent tendencies allows you to make certain calls that that you wouldn't make if you never didn't notice such stuff, right? So I feel like listen to this video. Some of these scenarios are applicable now but might not be applicable in the future if you're watching this in the future. But like the point I want to drive home is that when your opponent plays like a conquest match with you, you have to notice how they do a certain thing or how they do certain things, because a lot of these things that they've been doing it this way for a very long time already. Like they've been like retreating now straight up. They've been playing their nebulas on the right. They've been always covering 3 lanes, always covering 3 lanes with Doctor Doom. They've been snapping only when it feels safe. You know, these kind of things. Like it becomes a habit only when they've done it many times. And sometimes they don't realize that they've been doing it this way. And if you pick up on it before they pick up on it themselves, you can use it against them. So I feel like the most evergreen part of this video is firstly, you gotta practice this because it doesn't make sense if you don't practice this. You gotta see it happen, you gotta feel it, you gotta know like, oh, this is how it's supposed to feel, how it's supposed to look. And secondly, I feel like whatever cards get printed in the future in Marvel Snap, however the game changes, I think as long as the core dynamic of like battle mode doesn't change, you will be able to use your opponent's tendencies against them, and you'll be surprised how often people do the things the same way. And if you pick up the pattern, and before they pick up the pattern, there's a very good chance that you can come out on top in this so-called 50-50 game that's more towards a 51-49 if you notice things. Also, I want to mention a little bit about how you can practice this tendency scouting thing, because there's no actual real like fixed way of doing it. But one of the interesting things I found when I like notice my opponent's tendencies is I notice when I guess wrong as well. You know, so I feel like the important thing is don't be afraid to try and think of it as like, oh, I noticed that he's doing it a certain way. Is he actually doing it like on purpose? Is it like a habit or whatever? Like you have to guess sometimes, you know. But like I feel like don't be afraid to try and guess. Like the more you try and guess it, the more often you tend to get it correct, you know, because you kind of know how to identify these kind of things going forward. So I feel like just try in your conquest games, like think about it. Think about it like okay, I have this read. Don't know, not sure if it makes sense, but I'm gonna like lean on it, and if it works, maybe I got it right. And then you keep practicing this, and afterward, it become like a habit. It becomes like a habit to scout. Instead of like a chore, you know. If it's like a chore, you feel like your games are very tedious. But like if it becomes a habit to notice, oh, this guy plays Nebula on the right, oh, this guy plays Nebula on the left, oh, this person is only snapping when he's winning. You know, if you start to notice these things subconsciously, you know you are there. Like if you start to notice these things like a little bit more subconsciously, you know, like all right, I am actually noticing things without my opponent realizing it. So that's one thing I feel like you should try going forward, which is just practice. Just like make reads, make calls. It could be the worst or stupidest reads ever, but like you need to practice this, and
Oh,
over time you'll get it right.
yep.
Yeah.
Oh, I've absolutely. Some of the times I'm wrong are the funniest times. Those are great.
Yeah.
It makes for good content for us, right? All
Mm.
right.
All right. That's all
Thank
from
you
me,
guys
man.
so much. Yep. And we will guys catch you guys next time. Again, make sure you're subscribed to Lammy's channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you all.
Bye bye.